The other visitors at Forest Lawn Cemetery would stop and stare at the elderly woman who spent entire days kneeling beside one particular grave. Alberta Gay seemed oblivious to their curious glances as she whispered to her son Marvin's headstone. But it wasn't just her words that made these visits special. It was what she secretly buried beneath the soil each time. 20 years later, a maintenance worker's discovery would reveal the most beautiful secret in cemetery history. If stories of love that transcend death move you as deeply, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of Marvin Gaye. April 1st, 1985. Exactly 1 year after gunshots had silenced the voice of the Prince of Soul forever, Alberta Gay made her first pilgrimage to Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. She was 70 years old, her back permanently curved from decades of bending over sewing machines and kitchen sinks, but nothing could keep her from this journey. The groundskeepers watched as this small, dignified woman in her best Sunday dress approached the simple granite marker that read Marvin Gaye Jr., and slowly, carefully lowered herself to her knees on the damp grass. What happened next would become a ritual that continued for 23 years until Alberta's own death in 2008. Every April 1st, without fail, she would arrive at sunrise and remain until sunset, her arthritic knees pressed against the earth, her weathered hands folded in prayer or reaching out to touch the cold stone that bore her son's name. But the cemetery staff had no idea that Alberta was doing more than grieving. She was continuing a conversation that death had interrupted, and documenting that conversation in a way that would eventually touch hearts around the world. James Mitchell was just 28 years old when he started working as a groundskeeper at Forest Lawn, and Alberta Gay's annual vigil quickly became the most moving sight he encountered in his daily rounds. Year after year, he would see her small figure hunched over Marvin's grave, her lips moving in constant conversation, her eyes closed as if she were listening to responses only she could hear. Sometimes she would laugh softly, as if Marvin had just told her one of his jokes. Other times, tears would stream down her cheeks as she spoke about the pain of losing him, about the music he would never make, about the grandchildren he would never meet. The ritual always followed the same pattern. Alberta would arrive in a taxi just as the cemetery gates opened at 7 in the morning, carrying a small wicker basket and a thermos of coffee. She would spend the first hour cleaning Marvin's grave with meticulous care, polishing the headstone until it gleamed, arranging fresh flowers in the bronze vase, pulling every weed from the surrounding grass. Then came the hours of conversation, her voice so soft that even when Mitchell worked nearby he could never make out her words. But it was what happened just before she left that would later prove to be the most significant part of her visits. As the sun began to set each April 1st, Alberta would reach into her wicker basket and pull out a folded piece of paper. With the same careful precision she'd once used to hem Marvin's stage costumes, she would dig a small hole near the base of the headstone, place the paper inside, and cover it with soil and flower petals. Mitchell watched this ritual for years, assuming it was simply a mother's way of leaving a prayer or a poem for her deceased son. He had no idea that Alberta was creating an archive of letters that would one day reveal the depth of a mother's love and the ongoing relationship between a grieving parent and her lost child. The letters began as simple expressions of grief and longing, but as the years passed, they evolved into detailed updates about family news, reflections on Marvin's music and legacy, and even discussions about current events that Alberta thought would interest her son. She wrote about his children, how Marvin III was struggling with his father's death, how Nona was developing her own musical talents, how Frankie was trying to keep the family together. She shared news about the civil rights movement, about the music industry, about the world that kept changing even though Marvin was no longer part of it. But Alberta's letters contained more than just news and updates. They revealed a mother who refused to let death end her relationship with her son, who continued to offer advice, express pride, share concerns, and provide the unconditional love that had sustained Marvin throughout his troubled life. She wrote about her dreams where Marvin would visit her, looking young and healthy and free from the demons that had tormented him in his final years. She described the signs she believed he was sending her, the way his songs would come on the radio at meaningful moments, the butterflies that would land on his grave during her visits, the inexplicable sense of peace that would wash over her when she spoke his name. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, Alberta's annual vigils began to attract attention from other cemetery visitors. Word spread quietly through the community about the elderly woman who spent entire days talking to her son's grave, and people would deliberately walk past Marvin Gaye's burial site hoping to catch a glimpse of this devoted mother. Some visitors were moved to tears by the sight of Alberta's unwavering faithfulness. Others were inspired by her refusal to let grief defeat her. A few even approached her to share their own stories of loss, finding comfort in her gentle presence and obvious strength. Mitchell, now a senior groundskeeper, had developed a protective attitude toward Alberta. He would ensure that her favorite spot near the grave remained unoccupied, quietly discourage overly curious visitors from lingering too long, and even began timing his lunch break to coincide with hers, sitting at a respectful distance in case she needed assistance. Over the years, he'd witnessed Alberta's transformation from a woman consumed by fresh grief to someone who had found a way to maintain joy and connection despite profound loss. Her conversations with Marvin's grave had evolved from desperate pleas for him to return to peaceful discussions about life, love, and the continuation of family bonds beyond death. The content of Alberta's letters reflected this emotional journey. In the early years, they were filled with raw pain and desperate questions. Why had Marvin chosen to provoke his father that terrible morning? Why couldn't she have prevented the tragedy that everyone could see coming? How was she supposed to continue living when half her heart was buried in this California soil? But as time passed, her letters became less about her own suffering and more about celebrating Marvin's life and maintaining their relationship in a new form. She wrote about the dreams that brought them together, describing conversations they would have about his music, his children, his hopes for the afterlife. Alberta told Marvin about the fans who still came to his grave, sharing their stories of how his music had changed their lives. She updated him on the legal battles surrounding his estate, on the tribute albums being recorded in his honor, on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction that finally recognized his contributions to American music. Through her letters, Alberta kept Marvin informed about a world that continued to celebrate his legacy even as it mourned his absence. But perhaps the most touching aspect of Alberta's correspondence was how she continued to mother Marvin even in death. Her letters were filled with the same expressions of pride, concern, and unconditional love that had characterized their relationship when he was alive. She told him she was proud of the way his music continued to inspire new generations of artists. She expressed concern about his children and how they were coping with their father's fame and tragic death. She offered forgiveness for the pain his drug addiction had caused the family and reminded him that he would always be her baby boy no matter what mistakes he had made in life. The letters also revealed Alberta's deep spirituality and her belief that death was not an ending but a transformation. She wrote about her faith that she would see Marvin again in heaven, about her conviction that he was watching over the family from his new vantage point, about her certainty that their love for each other would survive any separation. These weren't the desperate fantasies of a woman unable to accept reality, but the mature reflections of someone who had found a way to maintain hope and connection in the face of unimaginable loss. As the 20th anniversary of Marvin's death approached in 2004, Alberta's health began to decline noticeably. Mitchell watched with growing concern as her annual vigils became more challenging for her aging body. She moved more slowly, needed help getting up from her kneeling position, and sometimes seemed confused about dates or details. But her devotion to the ritual never wavered, and her conversations with Marvin's grave remained as tender and detailed as ever. The content of her letters during this period reflected her awareness that their time together on Earth was growing short. She wrote about her readiness to join him, about her excitement at the prospect of their reunion, about her confidence that he would be waiting for her when her own time came. But she also expressed concern about what would happen to their correspondence once she was gone, wondering who would continue to bring Marvin news about the family and the world, who would remember to tell him about the small daily events that matter so much to mothers and sons. Alberta Gay's final visit to Marvin's grave took place on April 1, 2008, just 3 months before her death at age 93. Mitchell watched with a heavy heart as she performed her ritual one last time, her movements slow and careful but her devotion unchanged. She spent longer than usual at the grave that day, and her conversation with Marvin seemed more intense, more urgent than in previous years. When she finally buried her letter and prepared to leave, she looked back at the headstone with an expression Mitchell would never forget, part sadness, part gratitude, and part anticipation, as if she were saying not goodbye but see you soon. 3 months later, when Alberta passed away peacefully in her sleep, Mitchell found himself thinking about the 23 letters buried near Marvin's grave. He had always respected Alberta's privacy and never questioned the contents of her annual deposits, but now he felt a responsibility to preserve whatever she had left behind. With permission from the cemetery administration and Alberta's surviving family members, Mitchell carefully excavated the area around Marvin's headstone where Alberta had conducted her annual ritual. What he discovered exceeded his wildest imagination. 23 letters, each carefully wrapped in plastic and sealed in small containers to protect them from moisture and decay. Some were written on her best stationery, others on simple notebook paper, but all were filled with Alberta's careful handwriting, and her mother's heart poured out in words. The earliest letters were water-stained and fragile, but the more recent ones were perfectly preserved, creating a unique archive of maternal love that spanned nearly a quarter century. Reading Alberta's letters with the family's permission, Mitchell and Marvin's relatives discovered a treasure trove of family history, personal reflections, and spiritual insights that provided an unprecedented window into the ongoing relationship between a mother and her deceased son. The letters revealed details about Marvin's childhood that had never been publicly shared, insights into his creative process from someone who had watched it develop from the beginning, and perspectives on his struggles with fame and addiction from the one person who had loved him unconditionally throughout his life. But beyond their historical value, Alberta's letters demonstrated something even more profound about the nature of love and loss. They showed how a mother's love could transcend death, how grief could be transformed into ongoing connection, and how the act of writing and remembering could keep relationships alive even when one person was no longer physically present. Alberta had refused to let death end her role as Marvin's mother, continuing to offer him guidance, support, and news from the world he had left behind. The discovery of Alberta's letters created a sensation within Marvin Gaye's fan community and beyond. Music historians recognized them as an invaluable primary source document about one of soul music's greatest artists. Grief counselors saw them as a beautiful example of healthy mourning and continuing bonds. Mothers who had lost children found comfort and inspiration in Alberta's refusal to let death silence her maternal voice. The letters were eventually compiled into a book, with proceeds donated to music education programs in Marvin's memory. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Marvin's own children, who found in their grandmother's words a deeper understanding of their father's life and their own grief journey. Alberta's letters helped them see Marvin, not just as a famous musician or a troubled father, but as someone who had been deeply loved and continually remembered by the woman who knew him best. Through her words, they could feel the strength of family bonds that death could not break, and the power of love to create meaning even in the face of profound loss. Today, visitors to Forest Lawn Cemetery still come to pay their respects at Marvin Gaye's grave, but now they also come to honor Alberta Gay and the remarkable example she set of how love can endure beyond death. A small plaque near the headstone acknowledges her 23-year vigil and the letters that documented her ongoing relationship with her son. The plaque includes one of Alberta's most beautiful passages, written in her final letter. "Death tried to separate us, baby, but love is stronger than death. I'll keep talking to you until I can hold you again, and then we'll have forever to catch up on everything we missed." The story of Alberta Gay's letters reminds us that the bonds between parents and children are among the strongest forces in human experience, capable of surviving even the ultimate separation. Her example shows us that grief doesn't have to mean silence, that love doesn't have to end with death, and that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion happen not in public recognition but in quiet moments of connection between two hearts that refuse to be parted. Alberta Gay knelt at her son's grave for hours because she understood something that took the rest of the world decades to discover, that love is the one thing death cannot touch, and that mothers never stop being mothers, no matter what circumstances try to tell them otherwise.